The thunder of hoofbeats pounded across the dusty plains as Preston Zachary rode like the devil himself was on his tail, his mare's labored breathing matching the ragged cadence of his own broken heart. It had been exactly 2 years since he'd buried Sarah, his wife of 8 years, along with their unborn child. 2 years since he'd buried his heart alongside them and sworn never to feel again. Wyoming Territory, 1875. Preston had made a name for himself as one of the most skilled ranchers in Sweetwater County, though few knew the man behind the reputation. At 32, his once youthful face had hardened into a mask of quiet determination, his blue eyes turned cold as the winter sky. The locals knew better than to mention his past. Those who did quickly found themselves facing his icy stare, or worse, completely ignored as if they'd become invisible. "Faster, Willow," he urged his faithful mare as dark clouds gathered on the horizon. The rain was coming, and he needed to check the eastern fence line before heading back to his ranch. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a fitting backdrop to his solitary existence. Preston's ranch, the Double Z, sprawled across 800 acres of prime Wyoming grazing land. What had once been a dream shared with Sarah was now merely a place where he existed, moving through each day with mechanical precision. The ranch hands knew their boss was fair but distant, generous with pay but stingy with words. The first heavy raindrops began to fall as Preston spotted something unusual near the creek that marked his eastern boundary: a wagon, its canvas top billowing in the strengthening wind. As he approached, he noticed one wheel had sunk deep into the mud near the creek bank. A figure emerged from behind the wagon, struggling with a large trunk. Preston slowed Willow to a walk, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. "Hello there," called a decidedly female voice that carried even over the gathering storm. "I don't suppose you're the answer to my prayers." Preston didn't respond immediately, studying the woman as he drew closer. She was tall and slender, dressed in a practical traveling outfit that had seen better days. Her auburn hair was partially contained in a loose bun, with errant strands whipping about her face in the wind. "You're trespassing on Double Z land," he stated flatly, remaining mounted. The woman placed her hands on her hips, looking up at him with remarkable composure considering her situation. "Well, I hadn't planned on it, Mr. Double Z. My wheel decided your creek bank looked like a fine place to get stuck." Something in her tone, not quite defiance, not quite humor, made Preston pause. He hadn't expected that response. Most people cowered or apologized when confronted with his stern demeanor. "Where were you headed?" he asked, dismounting but maintaining his distance. "Silver Springs. I'm the new schoolteacher." She extended her hand. "Priscilla Ainsworth." Preston looked at her outstretched hand but didn't take it. "Silver Springs is 10 miles north. You're off course." Priscilla slowly lowered her hand, but her eyes, a striking hazel, didn't waver. "Yes, well, the gentleman in Cheyenne who sold me this map might have exaggerated his cartography skills." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket and held it up, now speckled with raindrops. The downpour intensified, and Preston found himself faced with a dilemma. The proper thing would be to offer shelter, but bringing a stranger, a woman, no less, to his ranch went against every wall he'd built around himself. "Storm's getting worse," he finally said, as thunder cracked overhead. "You can't stay here, and you won't make it to Silver Springs tonight." "I gathered that much," she replied, pushing wet hair from her face. "I don't suppose you might suggest an alternative?" Preston sighed, the sound nearly lost in the rain. "I'm Preston Zachary. My ranch house is about 2 miles west. We can shelter your wagon and horse there until the storm passes." For the first time, her confident facade showed a crack of uncertainty. "That's very kind, Mr. Zachary, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not kindness, Miss Ainsworth. It's practicality. I won't have a woman's death on my conscience because she drowned in a flash flood on my property." "How chivalrous," she muttered, but relief was evident in her expression. "I'll need help with the wheel." Together they worked in the pounding rain, using a fallen branch as leverage to free the wheel from the mud. Preston couldn't help but notice that Priscilla worked alongside him without complaint, her small hands gripping the wet wood with determination. When they finally freed the wagon, her face split into a wide smile that caught him off guard. "Well, that's done. Not so terrible with 2, is it?" she exclaimed, brushing muddy hands against her already ruined skirt. Preston didn't reply, merely gesturing for her to follow as he mounted Willow. He'd lead the way while she drove her wagon. The journey to the ranch house was slow and miserable, with the rain turning from steady to torrential. By the time the white clapboard house came into view, both were thoroughly soaked and chilled. Preston's foreman, Matthew, emerged from the barn as they approached, his weathered face registering surprise at the sight of a woman on the property. "Matt, stable Miss Ainsworth's horse and secure her wagon," Preston called over the storm's roar. "She'll be staying until the weather clears." Matthew nodded, not asking questions, another reason Preston valued him. The older man immediately took the reins of Priscilla's horse as Preston helped her down from the wagon seat. The main house of the Double Z was substantial but Spartan, reflecting its owner's utilitarian approach to living. As Preston led Priscilla inside, she couldn't suppress a small gasp when she stepped into the entry hall. Despite the home's size, it felt hollow somehow, as if the soul had been removed, leaving only the structure behind. "You can dry off in here," Preston said, showing her to a sitting room with a fireplace where embers still glowed. "I'll have Mrs. Cooper bring you some dry clothes and prepare a room." "Mrs. Cooper?" Priscilla questioned, standing awkwardly on the woven rug, afraid to drip on anything. "Housekeeper, lives in town but stays here during bad weather." His words were clipped, efficient. Priscilla nodded, then unexpectedly smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Zachary. Truly, I know this isn't how you plan to spend your evening." Something about her smile, genuine and warm despite her bedraggled appearance, momentarily disarmed him. For a fleeting second, the mask slipped, and confusion flashed across his features before the familiar stoicism returned. "I'll send Mrs. Cooper," he said, turning abruptly and leaving her alone. Preston found Mrs. Cooper already bustling about the kitchen, a plump, efficient woman in her 50s who had been with the ranch since before Sarah's death. Unlike the others, she occasionally dared to speak to Preston as a person rather than just an employer. "I saw you coming in with company," she said without preamble. "First time in 2 years you've brought anyone to the house." "It wasn't planned," he replied curtly. "She's stranded, the new schoolteacher for Silver Springs. She needs dry clothes and a room for the night, Mrs." Cooper studied him with knowing eyes. "About your height, that one, but slimmer. I might have something that'll do, and I'll put her in the blue room. It's the only guest room I keep aired regular." Preston nodded, grateful for her efficiency. "I'll be in my study." "You'll be changing into dry clothes yourself before you catch your death," she corrected firmly. "And then you'll be joining your guest for supper. I won't have it said that Preston Zachary doesn't know basic hospitality." He opened his mouth to object, then closed it at her stern expression. "Mrs." Cooper was one of the few people who seemed immune to his cold demeanor, perhaps because she'd been there through it all, had seen him broken after Sarah's death. "Fine," he conceded. "Half an hour." 30 minutes later, Preston found himself seated across from Priscilla Ainsworth at his rarely used dining table. She was dressed in what he recognized as one of Mrs. Cooper's Sunday dresses, altered hastily with pins to fit her taller frame. Her hair, now dry, fell in loose waves past her shoulders, the auburn color more vivid than he'd initially thought. "This is delicious," Priscilla said, breaking the uncomfortable silence as they ate Mrs. Cooper's beef stew. "You're fortunate to have such a talented cook." Preston nodded. "Mrs. Cooper has been with the ranch for 12 years. And how long have you been here?" she asked, seeming genuinely interested. 10 years. His tone didn't invite further questions, but Priscilla either didn't notice or chose to ignore the warning. "What brought you to Wyoming?" "You don't sound like you're from these parts originally." Preston set down his spoon with deliberate care. "Miss Ainsworth, I've offered you shelter for the night. I haven't invited an interrogation into my personal affairs." Instead of being offended, Priscilla laughed, a clear, melodious sound that seemed to echo in the stillness of the house. Preston stared at her, startled by both the sound and his reaction to it. Something deep within his chest stirred, like soil being disturbed after a long winter. "I do apologize, Mr. Zachary," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Where I come from, asking someone about themselves is considered conversation, not interrogation, but I'll respect your preference for silence." "Where do you come from?" he found himself asking, surprising them both. Priscilla's smile softened. Boston, most recently, but I've lived many places. My father was a professor who took teaching positions wherever they were offered. We lived in New York, Philadelphia, even spent a year in London when I was 16. That's a long way from Silver Springs, Wyoming. Yes, well, I wanted an adventure of my own. Teaching positions for women are limited in the East, but out here, she gestured vaguely, they're desperate enough for education that they'll take a woman with credentials like mine. And what credentials are those? I studied at the Boston Female Normal School. I'm qualified to teach children from primary age through secondary education. Pride colored her voice. I can handle a classroom of 40 students if necessary, though I understand Silver Springs has fewer than 20 school-age children. Preston found himself wondering what had driven this educated Eastern woman to seek a teaching position in a frontier town like Silver Springs. There was more to her story, he was certain, but he refrained from prying. After all, he'd just objected to her questions about his own past. The remainder of the meal passed with sporadic conversation, mostly initiated by Priscilla. Preston noticed she had a way of speaking that didn't demand response. She would share observations or thoughts, then allow comfortable silence to fall, never pushing for more than he was willing to give. After dinner, Mrs. Cooper brought coffee and apple pie to the sitting room. The storm continued to rage outside, rain lashing against the windows while lightning illuminated the room in brief, brilliant flashes. I love storms, Priscilla said unexpectedly, staring out the window. They remind us how small we are in the grand scheme of things. Preston didn't respond, but he watched her profile as she gazed at the tempest outside. There was something almost peaceful about her presence, despite her obvious energy and vitality. She seemed completely at ease in the world, a stark contrast to his own carefully maintained isolation. "Do you read, Mr. Zachary?" she asked suddenly, turning from the window to survey the room. "I notice you have quite a collection of books." The shelves lining one wall had been Sarah's pride. Preston rarely touched them now, but he couldn't bring himself to remove them either. "Some," he replied noncommittally. Priscilla moved to examine the titles, running her fingers lightly over the spines. Dickens, Austen, Shakespeare, whoever collected these had excellent taste. "My wife," Preston said before he could stop himself. Priscilla turned, surprise evident in her expression, not at the revelation that he was married, but perhaps that he had volunteered the information. "She had a passion for literature," he continued, his voice tight. "She taught me to appreciate it as well." "Is she visiting family?" Priscilla asked gently, Preston's jaw clenched. "She's dead, 2 years now." The words hung in the air between them. Priscilla's expression shifted from surprise to genuine sympathy, but mercifully she didn't offer platitudes or press for details. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "It must be difficult to maintain such a large operation without her." The acknowledgement of Sarah as a partner rather than merely a wife caught Preston off guard. Most people in these parts assumed a woman's role was limited to household management and child-rearing, not the business of ranching. "She was integral to building this place," he admitted. "She had a way with the numbers, kept all the books, could spot a bad business deal from miles away." Priscilla smiled softly. "She sounds remarkable." "She was." Preston stood abruptly. "It's getting late. Mrs. Cooper will have prepared your room by now." If Priscilla was startled by his sudden withdrawal, she didn't show it. She merely nodded and rose as well. "Of course. Thank you again for your hospitality, Mr. Zachary." Preston called for Mrs. Cooper, who appeared to escort Priscilla to her room. Left alone, he poured himself a whiskey and stared into the dying fire, unsettled by how much he'd revealed to a stranger. He'd spoken more about Sarah tonight than he had in months, and the realization disturbed him. Morning arrived with clear skies and birdsong. Preston had been up since dawn, checking on livestock and assessing any damage from the storm. When he returned to the house for breakfast, he found Priscilla already in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Cooper prepare the meal. "Good morning, Mr. Zachary," she greeted cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind my invading your kitchen. I can't sit idle while others work, a failing of mine, according to my mother." "Nonsense," Mrs. Cooper interjected before Preston could respond. "Miss Ainsworth has been a tremendous help, makes the best biscuits I've tasted in years." Preston nodded awkwardly, unprepared for the domestic scene before him. Priscilla had pinned her hair up again, though more neatly than yesterday, and wore her own clothes, now cleaned and pressed. She moved about the kitchen with graceful efficiency as if she belonged there. The thought jolted him and he quickly pushed it away. "I've had Matthew check your wagon," he said, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Cooper. "The wheel needed some reinforcement, but it's sound now. You can leave for Silver Springs after breakfast if you wish." Something like disappointment flickered across Priscilla's face, but she quickly masked it with a smile. "That's very kind. I should arrive before midday then. The school board will be relieved I was expected yesterday." Breakfast was a livelier affair than any meal at the Double Z had been in years. Mrs. Cooper, normally reserved around Preston, chatted freely with Priscilla about Silver Springs and its inhabitants. Preston learned that the town had grown considerably in the past few years, now boasting a general store, a small hotel, a church, and even a part-time doctor. "The school's been closed for nearly 6 months," Mrs. Cooper explained. "Last teacher was a young man who decided gold mining in Colorado held more promise than educating frontier children." "Their loss is my gain," Priscilla replied. "I'm looking forward to establishing a proper educational program. Children deserve quality schooling regardless of where they live." Preston found himself watching her as she spoke passionately about her plans for the school. Her eyes lit up, her hands gestured expressively, and occasionally she'd laugh at her own enthusiasm, that same clear, musical laugh that had startled him the night before. After breakfast, Preston insisted on helping load Priscilla's trunk back onto her wagon. The morning sun illuminated her features as she thanked him, making her hazel eyes appear almost golden. "I don't know how to repay your kindness, Mr. Zachary," she said earnestly. "No repayment necessary," he replied stiffly. "Just staying on course in the future would be advisable." Priscilla laughed, not taking offense at his blunt words. "Fair enough, though I might not have met you otherwise, and that would have been a shame." Preston was saved from responding by Matthew's arrival with Priscilla's horse, now rested and fed. As she prepared to depart, she turned to Preston one last time. "Silver Springs isn't far. Perhaps you might visit sometime. I understand ranchers occasionally need supplies from town." "Perhaps," he said noncommittally, though they both knew it was unlikely. Preston rarely went to town, sending his ranch hands instead, with a final smile and a wave to Mrs. Cooper. Priscilla drove her wagon down the long drive of the Double Z, her straight-backed figure gradually diminishing in the distance. Preston stood watching long after she disappeared from view, an unfamiliar sensation gnawing at his chest. The ranch seemed unusually quiet after Priscilla's departure. Even Mrs. Cooper commented on it before returning to town that afternoon. "Remarkable woman, that Miss Ainsworth," she observed. "Brings light wherever she goes, I'd wager." Preston grunted noncommittally, but Mrs. Cooper's words stayed with him as he went about his day. By evening, he'd convinced himself that the unsettled feeling would pass. Priscilla Ainsworth was simply a disruption to his routine, nothing more. Yet as days passed, Preston found his thoughts returning to the schoolteacher with surprising frequency. He caught himself wondering how she was settling into Silver Springs, whether the accommodations were adequate, if the children were responding to her teaching methods. These unbidden thoughts irritated him, yet he couldn't seem to banish them. 2 weeks after Priscilla's unexpected visit, Preston found himself in the uncomfortable position of needing to go into town. A specialized part for the new milling equipment had arrived at the general store, and the storekeeper had sent word that it required personal signature for delivery. Silver Springs had indeed grown since Preston's last visit, nearly 8 months prior. New buildings lined the main street, and more people bustled about than he remembered. As he tied Willow to the hitching post outside the general store, he purposely avoided looking toward the schoolhouse visible at the end of the street. His business concluded quickly, Preston stepped back onto the boardwalk, package in hand, intending to return directly to the ranch. Fate, however, had other plans. "Mr. Zachary, what a pleasant surprise." The familiar voice halted him in his tracks. Turning, he found Priscilla approaching, a stack of books balanced in her arms and a genuine smile lighting her face. She wore a simple blue dress with her hair neatly arranged, looking every bit the proper schoolteacher, yet there was a vibrancy about her that set her apart from the other townspeople. Miss Ainsworth, he acknowledged with a slight nod. I was just telling Mrs. Parker about your magnificent library, she said, gesturing toward the woman accompanying her, whom Preston recognized as the minister's wife. She's helping me establish a small collection for the school. Mrs. Parker, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, smiled politely. How fortunate that Miss Ainsworth found shelter with you during that terrible storm, Mr. Zachary. She's been a blessing to our community already. Preston shifted uncomfortably under their combined attention. Yes, well, I should be heading back. Actually, Priscilla said quickly, I was hoping to speak with you about something. Would you have a moment? Curiosity overcame his desire to escape. I suppose. Mrs. Parker tactfully excused herself, leaving them standing awkwardly on the boardwalk. I'm organizing a small exhibition for the children, Priscilla explained. I want to expose them to different professions and skills. I've arranged for the blacksmith and Dr. Collins to give demonstrations, but I wondered if you might be willing to speak about ranching. Many of the children come from farming families, but few have seen a large cattle operation. Preston stared at her, momentarily speechless. Of all the things she might have asked, this was unexpected. You want me to speak to children about ranching? Yes, she replied simply. Next Friday afternoon. Nothing elaborate, just 30 minutes of your time to explain the basics and perhaps answer questions. His immediate instinct was to refuse. He'd spent 2 years avoiding unnecessary social contact, and the idea of standing before a classroom of curious children was distinctly unappealing. Yet something in Priscilla's expectant expression made the refusal stick in his throat. I'm not much for public speaking, he said instead. The audience is primarily 10-year-olds, Mr. Zachary. Their standards for oratory excellence are remarkably forgiving. Her eyes twinkled with humor. Despite himself, Preston felt the corner of his mouth twitch. I'll consider it. The brightness of her smile at this meager concession was startling. Wonderful. Shall I pencil you in for 2 o'clock next Friday then? Somehow, Preston found himself nodding before fully processing what he was agreeing to. As he rode back to the Double Z, he questioned his own sanity. What had possessed him to even consider such an invitation? The answer, though he was reluctant to acknowledge it, had everything to do with the woman who'd asked. There was something about Priscilla Ainsworth that made saying no to her uncommonly difficult. The next week passed with Preston alternating between regretting his decision and rehearsing what he might say to a classroom of children. By Friday morning, he'd nearly convinced himself to send a message claiming urgent ranch business, but some stubborn part of him rejected the cowardly option. At precisely 1:45, Preston found himself standing outside the Silver Springs schoolhouse, hat in hand, feeling more nervous than he had in years. The sound of children's voices drifted through the open windows, along with an occasional burst of laughter that he recognized immediately as Priscilla's. Drawing a deep breath, he mounted the steps and knocked on the door frame. The classroom fell silent as he entered, 20 pairs of curious eyes turning to inspect the visitor. At the front of the room, Priscilla stood beside a large slate board, her face lighting up at the sight of him. Children, this is Mr. Zachary, owner of the Double Z Ranch, she announced. As I mentioned, he's here to tell us about cattle ranching. Please show him the same excellent attention you gave Mr. Peterson when he explained blacksmithing. Preston moved awkwardly to the front of the room, acutely aware of his dusty boots and the faint smell of horses that clung to his clothes despite his best efforts to clean up. For a moment, he stood frozen, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Then Priscilla stepped closer, her voice low and encouraging. Just tell them how you started, she suggested. Children love stories about beginnings. Somehow, her presence steadied him. Preston cleared his throat and began speaking about his arrival in Wyoming Territory 10 years earlier with nothing but a dream and determination. To his surprise, once he started talking about the ranch, words came more easily. The children listened with apparent interest, asking intelligent questions about cattle breeds, seasonal work, and the challenges of Wyoming winters. As the session progressed, Preston found himself relaxing, even enjoying the children's enthusiasm. One small boy in the front row seemed particularly fascinated by descriptions of roundups. his eyes widening as Preston explained how skilled cowboys could separate specific animals from the herd. "Could we visit?" the boy blurted out suddenly. "To see for ourselves." Before Preston could formulate a response, Priscilla intervened smoothly. "That's a wonderful idea, Tommy, but we'd need to consider the logistics. Perhaps Mr. Zachary could think about hosting us someday when it's convenient for his operation." The session concluded with the children thanking Preston in unison, their bright faces making him unexpectedly pleased that he'd come. As they filed out for the day, Priscilla approached him with genuine warmth in her expression. "That was marvelous," she said. "You have quite a talent for explanation. I don't think Tommy blinked once during your entire talk about branding." Preston felt uncharacteristically self-conscious under her praise. "They're good kids, attentive." "That's partially their doing, partially mine," she replied with a smile. "A teacher's job is to nurture curiosity, not just impart facts." She began gathering papers from her desk. "Would you care for some coffee? I always brew a pot after school. Teaching is thirsty work." The invitation was casual, yet Preston sensed it represented something more significant. Accepting meant acknowledging a connection beyond their chance meeting during the storm. "I have time," he heard himself say. Priscilla led him to a small room adjoining the classroom, evidently serving as both her office and living quarters. The space was modest but surprisingly homey, with shelves of books, a small stove, and a window overlooking a flowering crabapple tree. A narrow bed occupied one corner, neatly made with a colorful quilt. "It's not much," she said, noticing his appraisal, "but the school board included accommodations with the position. I find it quite sufficient for my needs." As she prepared coffee, Preston observed how she'd transformed the utilitarian space with personal touches: a vase of wildflowers, carefully arranged books, a comfortable cushion on the wooden chair. The room reflected its occupant, practical yet warm, organized yet inviting. "How are you finding Silver Springs?" he asked, accepting a steaming cup. Priscilla settled into the chair opposite him. "I like it very much. The people have been welcoming, the children eager to learn. It's a community on the rise. And Boston, do you miss it?" A shadow crossed her face briefly. "Parts of it, the libraries certainly, the museums and concerts." She paused, sipping her coffee. "But not everything I left behind deserves to be missed." The carefully neutral tone told Preston there was more to her story than she was sharing, but he didn't press. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun streaming through the window. "Tommy's question," Preston said suddenly, "about visiting the ranch." Priscilla looked up, surprised. "Yes, it's not a bad idea. Educational, like you said." He stared into his coffee cup. "If you wanted to bring them, I could arrange a proper demonstration. Roundups starting next week. They could see the operation in action." The delight that spread across Priscilla's face made something tighten in Preston's chest. "Are you serious? The children would be absolutely thrilled. Next Thursday would work, if you can arrange transportation for them. I'm sure the parents would help, many have wagons." Her excitement was palpable. "This is incredibly generous, Mr. Zachary." "Preston," he said impulsively. "My friends call me Preston." Priscilla's smile softened. "Preston," she repeated, the name sounding different in her voice. "Then you must call me Priscilla." Something shifted between them in that moment. A boundary crossed. A door opened that Preston had long kept shut. It terrified him, yet he couldn't bring himself to retreat. Their conversation continued, moving from school matters to books they'd both read, to observations about the changing landscape of Wyoming Territory. Preston was startled to realize the sun had begun to set. He'd spent nearly 2 hours in Priscilla's company without noticing the passage of time. "I should go," he said reluctantly, rising from his chair. "It's a fair ride back to the ranch." Priscilla walked him to the schoolhouse door. "Thank you again for today. The children will be talking about it for weeks." On impulse, Preston reached for her hand. "I enjoyed it more than I expected to." Her fingers were warm in his, and neither seemed in a hurry to break the contact. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "you might enjoy other unexpected experiences if you gave them a chance." The invitation in her words was subtle but unmistakable. Preston felt a surge of panic mingled with longing emotions he'd thought long buried. Abruptly, he released her hand. Thursday, he said, his voice rougher than intended. Bring the children around 10. With a quick nod, he turned and strode toward where Willow waited patiently. He could feel Priscilla's gaze on his back as he mounted and rode away, and it took considerable willpower not to look back. The days leading up to the school visit were unusually hectic at the Double Z. Preston found himself directing ranch hands to clean areas that hadn't seen attention in years, ensuring the demonstrations would be both impressive and safe for young visitors. Matthew watched these preparations with barely concealed amusement, but wisely kept his observations to himself. By Thursday morning, Preston was unaccountably nervous. He'd instructed the cook to prepare a special lunch for the children and had personally selected several gentle horses for them to pet. When the wagons carrying Priscilla and her students appeared on the horizon, he felt his heart rate quicken in a way that had nothing to do with the day's planned activities. The children's excitement was contagious as they tumbled from the wagons, their eyes wide at the sight of the sprawling ranch. Priscilla maintained remarkable control over her charges, organizing them into an orderly group with gentle efficiency. "Children, remember what we discussed about ranch safety," she instructed. "Stay together, listen carefully to instructions, and never approach an animal without permission." Preston stepped forward, oddly formal in clean clothes reserved for trips to town. "Welcome to the Double Z," he said, addressing the children but finding his eyes drawn to their teacher. Priscilla wore a simple dark blue skirt and white shirtwaist, practical for the outing yet somehow more flattering than the elaborate fashions Preston occasionally saw on ladies in town. Her hair was neatly pinned, but a few tendrils had already escaped in the breeze, framing her face. The morning proceeded better than Preston could have hoped. The children were enthralled by demonstrations of roping, amazed by the immensity of the barn, and delighted by the opportunity to pet the gentle horses. Young Tommy, who had first suggested the visit, proved to have a natural way with animals, something Preston quietly noted to Priscilla. "He's being raised by his grandmother," she explained softly as they watched the boy carefully stroking a palomino's nose. "His parents died of fever last year. He's remarkably resilient, but animals seem to comfort him in a way people sometimes can't." The simple observation revealed much about Priscilla's character. Her attention to her students extended far beyond academic concerns. She knew their stories, their struggles, their individual needs. It was the same quality Sarah had possessed, the ability to see people truly, not merely superficially. The thought no longer caused the sharp pain it once would have. Instead, Preston felt a bittersweet acknowledgement, as if Sarah herself might approve of the comparison. After lunch, as the children enjoyed a specially arranged demonstration of cattle sorting, Preston found himself standing beside Priscilla slightly apart from the group. "Your ranch is magnificent," she said, gazing across the sprawling property. "You've built something truly remarkable here." "We did," Preston corrected quietly. "My wife and I, Sarah." Priscilla turned to him, surprise evident in her expression not at the mention of Sarah but at his willingness to speak of her. "She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman," Priscilla said gently. "She was." Preston stared at the distant mountains. "We came out here with nothing but dreams and determination, built everything from scratch. She was pregnant when the fever took her." The words came easier than he'd expected. "Our child died with her." Priscilla's hand touched his arm lightly. "I'm so sorry, Preston. After she died, I just existed, kept the ranch running because it was all I had left of her, but I wasn't really living." "And now?" she asked softly. Preston looked at her then, really looked at the woman who had somehow breached the walls around his heart without his noticing. "Now I'm not sure. Something's changed." A shout from the cattle pen drew their attention before Priscilla could respond. The demonstration had concluded, and the children were applauding enthusiastically. The remainder of the visit passed quickly. As the wagons prepared to depart, Preston found himself reluctant to see them go one passenger in particular. Priscilla lingered after ensuring all the children were safely seated. "This meant a great deal to them," she said. "To me as well," Preston nodded, struggling to find words for what he wanted to say. "Silver Springs isn't that far," he finally managed. "I might have reason to visit town more often." The smile that bloomed on her face was worth the awkwardness of his delivery. "I would like that very much," she replied. In the weeks that followed, Preston found himself in Silver Springs with surprising frequency. There were supplies to be purchased, mail to collect, and somehow these errands often coincided with the end of the school day. Priscilla never seemed surprised to see him waiting outside the schoolhouse, as if his presence had become an expected part of her routine. Their friendship deepened through conversations over coffee in her quarters, occasional shared meals at the town's small restaurant, and walks along the creek that ran behind the schoolhouse. Preston discovered that, beneath Priscilla's cheerful competence, lay a complex woman with her own painful, past a broken engagement in Boston to a man who'd proven false, a father whose academic reputation had been tarnished by scandal, necessitating her move west for a fresh start. "We're both running from something in our own ways," she observed one evening as they sat on her small porch. "You by staying still, me by moving far away." The insight struck Preston as profoundly true. Does it help, the distance? Priscilla considered the question seriously. Sometimes. But I'm learning that geographical distance isn't the same as emotional healing. That requires facing what hurts, not just leaving it behind. Her words stayed with Preston long after he'd returned to the ranch that night. For 2 years, he'd kept Sarah's memory locked away, preserved like a pressed flower between the pages of a book, untouched, unchanged, but also unable to breathe or evolve. The next morning, Preston rose before dawn and did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He visited Sarah's grave on the small hill overlooking the ranch. The simple headstone stood sentinel against the lightening sky, the carved words still clear despite exposure to Wyoming's harsh elements. Sarah Elizabeth Zachary, beloved wife, 1843–1873, and infant son. Preston knelt in the dewy grass, removing his hat. "I've met someone," he said simply, his voice rough in the morning stillness. "I think you would like her. She has your spirit, your way of seeing through people's defenses." A breeze stirred the wildflowers growing beside the grave, and a meadowlark called from a nearby fence post. Preston continued speaking, words coming easier as dawn broke fully over the horizon. He told Sarah about Priscilla, about the children's visit to the ranch, about the changes in Silver Springs. As he spoke, he realized he wasn't seeking permission so much as sharing with someone who had known him better than anyone. "I'll always love you," he concluded, his fingers tracing the carved letters of her name. "But I think it's time for me to live again." As if in response, the rising sun broke through a bank of clouds, illuminating the grave and the surrounding hillside with golden light. Preston felt a weight lifting, not completely gone, but lighter, more bearable. That evening, Preston rode into Silver Springs with purpose rather than pretense. He found Priscilla in her garden behind the schoolhouse, kneeling among newly planted vegetables. She looked up in surprise at his unscheduled appearance, a smudge of dirt on her cheek and a questioning smile on her lips. "Preston, I wasn't expecting you today," he dismounted, securing Willow to the fence post. "I needed to see you." Something in his tone made her expression turn serious. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, no, I don't know." He paced a few steps, then turned to face her directly. "I visited Sarah's grave this morning, first time in nearly a year." Priscilla remained silent, giving him space to continue. "I realized something. About grief, about life." Preston took a deep breath. "When Sarah died, I thought my heart was buried with her. I didn't want to feel anything again, it hurt too much, so I just existed." He moved closer to her, drawn by something he could no longer deny. "But then you arrived, stuck in the mud during a thunderstorm, and you laughed, really laughed, even though everything was going wrong. And that laugh, it did something to me, started digging up what I'd buried." Priscilla's eyes glistened in the evening light. "Preston, please let me finish. I need to say this." He took her hands in his, marveling at how right they felt. "Every time I've seen you since then, every conversation, every smile, it's been like you're excavating my heart, bringing it back to life bit by bit. And it terrifies me, Priscilla. But for the first time in 2 years, I'm feeling something beyond grief, beyond emptiness." A tear slipped down her cheek, and instinctively Preston reached to brush it away, his fingers lingering against her skin. "I don't know where this leads," he continued softly. "I'm still figuring out how to live again, but I know that when I'm with you, I want to try, I want to feel, even if it means risking pain again." Priscilla's hand covered his where it rested against her face. "The heart is resilient," she whispered. "More so than we give it credit for. Mine has known disappointment too, yet here it is, beating rather insistently whenever you're near." Her words, simple and honest, unraveled the last of Preston's resistance. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as Priscilla responded, her hands moving to his shoulders. When they finally parted, Preston rested his forehead against hers, a sense of peace washing over him that he'd thought forever lost. "I'm not fully healed," he admitted. "I don't know if I ever will be completely." Priscilla's smile held understanding beyond her years. "None of us are, Preston. We all carry our scars. The trick isn't to erase them, but to find someone who sees their beauty, the evidence of a life fully lived, with all its joys and sorrows." As the summer sun set behind the distant mountains, casting long shadows across Priscilla's small garden, Preston Zachary felt his heart beating strong and sure for the first time in years. The path ahead was uncertain, but no longer would he walk it alone. His heart, once buried in grief, now beat with renewed purpose unearthed by a chance encounter, and the healing power of laughter from a remarkable woman who had journeyed west, seeking her own new beginning.